It is the autumn of 1940, and Britain stands alone. The German bombs are falling nightly. The skies over London glow orange from the fires of the Blitz. Down in the streets, wardens patrol with torches, pulling people into shelters, and the whole country has pulled itself into a kind of quiet, watchful tension. Everyone is suspicious of everyone else. Government posters remind citizens that wars have ears, that the enemy may be closer than you think. And in a small, unremarkable office near St James's Park in central London, a man sits across a table from another man who thought he was invisible. The man being questioned arrived by parachute not 3 nights ago. He speaks English well, too well, some might say, though his accent is convincing enough. His papers appear to be in order. His cover story is rehearsed and plausible. He claims to be a travelling salesman from the Midlands. Everything about him, on the surface, is thoroughly, boringly ordinary. But then one of the interrogators reaches across the table and picks up something the man had in his jacket pocket. Something he carried without thinking, the way any man would. Something so trivial, so everyday, that it never once crossed his mind it might betray him. It is a matchbox, a small, paper-covered rectangle, the kind you might find on any pub counter, any kitchen shelf, in any home across Britain. The spy had acquired it on the continent, or perhaps it had been handed to him by his handlers as part of his kit. Either way, he had given it no more thought than you or I would give a bus ticket. But the interrogator turns it over in his fingers and immediately knows something is wrong. The question is, how? How does a matchbox, one of the most mundane objects in human existence, give away a trained enemy agent? And why did the men of MI5 and the wartime security services know exactly what to look for? The answer reaches deep into the culture and manufacturing practices of everyday British life, and it reveals something fascinating about the nature of wartime deception. Because in a conflict where both sides were deploying vast resources to fool, mislead, and destroy one another, sometimes the most devastating intelligence failure wasn't a cracked cipher or a turned agent. Sometimes it was a matchbox. To understand why this matters, you need to understand the scale of Germany's espionage effort against Britain in the early years of the war. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence organization under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, had been preparing agents for British insertion since well before hostilities began. They had recruited, trained, and dispatched men and women whose job it was to land on British soil, blend into the population, and report back on troop movements, civilian morale, bomb damage, and anything else that might give the Wehrmacht an advantage. The operation was called, at various times, by various code names, but the ambition was consistent: put eyes inside Britain. What the Germans did not know, what they could not fully appreciate until it was too late, was that M15 had identified and either arrested or turned virtually every single agent they sent. The famous double-cross system, run by the 20 Committee under the Oxford academic John Masterman, had by 1941 achieved something almost miraculous: near total control of German intelligence flowing out of Britain. The Abwehr believed it had a working network of spies on the island. In fact, it had none. Every agent it trusted was feeding it carefully crafted disinformation. But catching those agents in the first place required something more than good luck. It required an intimate knowledge of exactly how a genuine British person lived, moved, and consumed the ordinary details of daily life. Because the German intelligence services were meticulous in their preparation, they briefed their agents extensively. They provided forged identity documents of remarkable quality. They drilled their men on British customs, British slang, British social conventions. What they could not fully replicate was the texture of British material culture, the specific, unremarkable, utterly taken for granted objects that filled a British person's pockets, handbag, or kitchen drawer. Objects that were manufactured in particular ways, to particular standards, with particular designs that had evolved organically over decades in response to the British market, British tastes, British habits, objects like a matchbox. The Bryant and May Company had been producing matches in Britain since 1843. By the time the Second World War began, the match industry had developed a set of quiet, reliable conventions that any British person would recognize instinctively, even if they could never articulate them. British matchboxes of the period had a particular weight to them. The drawer, the inner tray that slides out, fitted with a specific degree of friction, neither too tight nor too loose, a quality born of decades of refinement for the damp British climate. The sandpaper striking surface on the side was applied at a particular angle and with a particular grade of abrasive that produced a distinctive scratch when you drew a match across it. The matches themselves were a specific length, roughly 53 millimeters, give or take. The heads were a deep crimson red, made from a particular compound, and they produced a small, bright flare when struck before settling into a clean yellow flame. The wood of the sticks was almost always white aspen, cut from managed British and Scandinavian forests, and it had a faint pale color and smooth grain that anyone who had used matches all their life would know without thinking about it. The box itself was printed with specific typefaces, specific colors, specific proportions. Bryant and May had their own house style, as did the Swedish match companies that supplied the British market. The paper wrap was applied in a particular way, with the overlap of the seam running in a consistent direction. Continental matchboxes, German ones, Austrian ones, Swiss ones, were different in dozens of small ways. The matches were often slightly shorter or slightly thicker. The striking compound was coarser or finer. The box construction used a different method of gluing the paper over the cardboard. The typefaces were different. The color of the match heads was different. The smell, when you opened the box and held it to your nose, was different. None of these differences would mean anything to someone who had never thought about them. To the average person, a match is a match and a box is a box. But to a trained observer, someone who had been specifically briefed on what a genuine British matchbox looked and felt and smelled like, a continental box was immediately obvious. This brings us to the art of what historians have sometimes called pocket litter, the mundane personal items that security services on both sides paid extraordinary attention to during the war. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. MI5's interrogators were trained to examine everything a suspected agent carried. Every object told a story. A wallet might contain a receipt printed with German typefaces, or a tram ticket from a city in occupied Europe. A pen might be a foreign brand unavailable in wartime Britain. A cigarette case might hold a brand sold only on the continent. And a matchbox might be just slightly, unmistakably, wrong. The German intelligence services understood the concept of pocket litter well. They went to considerable lengths to equip their agents with convincing British items. Some of these items were genuine British goods that had been obtained through neutral countries before the war. Others were carefully manufactured imitations. But imitation is hard, harder than it sounds. A matchbox that has been manufactured to look British will pass a casual glance. It will not pass the hands of a man who has handled 10,000 British matchboxes and knows, in his fingers, and not just his eyes, exactly how one should feel. The weight is wrong. The friction of the drawer is wrong. The abrasive on the striking surface leaves a mark that is slightly too rough or slightly too smooth. The match head color is a fraction off. The smell of the sulfur compound is subtly different. These are not things you can easily specify in a manufacturing brief. They are the accumulated result of decades of production refinement in a specific country, for a specific market, under specific conditions. They are, in the most literal sense, culturally embedded. The agents who were caught carried their betrayers in their pockets, often without ever knowing it. Joseph Jacobs, who parachuted into a field near Ramsey in Huntingdonshire on 31st January 1941, broke his ankle on landing and was found by the Home Guard still clutching his parachute. His examination revealed a comprehensive collection of genuine-seeming British items, but several were not quite right. He was the last person to be executed at the Tower of London, shot by the firing squad on August 15, 1941. Karl Drucker and Werner Walti arrived on the Scottish coast by seaplane in September 1940 and took a train south. A sharp-eyed railway porter at Edinburgh Waverley noticed that one of them, travelling under the name François de Dicker, ate his breakfast in a way that struck him as foreign. The men were arrested before they had accomplished anything at all. Their belongings told the rest of the story. Gosta Caroli, codenamed Summer by British intelligence, parachuted into Northamptonshire in September 1940. He was identified and turned, becoming one of the early double agents of the double cross system. The items found on him were catalogued meticulously, and the discrepancies between genuine British goods and continental imitations were carefully noted and fed back into MI5's training program. The Matchbox, and objects like it, became part of a growing body of knowledge about how to spot a man who had rehearsed being British but had never actually lived it. The German effort to produce convincing British pocket litter was not negligible. The Abwehr's document forgers and material specialists worked hard to replicate British goods, and in some cases they succeeded well enough to fool a brief inspection. The Americans, entering the war after December 1941, developed their own versions of these techniques through the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA. The OSS produced elaborate kits for agents being inserted into occupied Europe. Kits that included not just forged papers, but carefully sourced genuine continental goods, continental cigarettes, continental matches, continental coins worn smooth in the pocket to the right degree. But the British had a head start of 2 years and an institutional knowledge born of hard, practical experience. By 1942, MI5's understanding of what a genuine British person actually carried in their pockets was exhaustive and precise. The training given to interrogators and security officers included sessions in which they were shown side-by-side comparisons of genuine British goods and continental imitations. They learned to identify the differences with their fingers as much as their eyes. They were given genuine matchboxes and continental copies and asked to tell them apart blindfolded. The Germans, for all their methodical preparation, could never quite bridge the gap between knowledge and experience. They could tell an agent what a British matchbox looked like. They could not give him the 10,000 small interactions with British matchboxes that would make him reach for it without thinking. The legacy of what happened in those interrogation rooms is, in many ways, the story of the double-cross system itself. Because every agent who was caught sometimes because of a matchbox, sometimes because of a cigarette, sometimes because of the way he held his knife and fork, was given a choice: cooperate and become a double agent feeding disinformation back to Berlin, refuse and face trial. Most cooperated, a few did not. The result was that by 1944, The Germans had no reliable intelligence about where the Allied landings in France would fall. They had been told by agents they trusted that the main thrust would come at the Pas de Calais, not Normandy. They believed it. Their panzer reserves sat uselessly in the wrong place on June 6, 1944, while the beaches were stormed. Scholars still debate how much individual elements of the double-cross system contributed to the success of D-Day. The precise weight of the matchbox evidence, of the pocket litter analysis, of the small material betrayals that led to each agent's capture. These are difficult to quantify. What is not difficult to quantify is the result. The Germans were deceived on a colossal scale. The landings succeeded. The matchbox was not the only instrument of that deception, but it was there at the beginning, in the jacket pocket of a man who thought he had covered every detail, who had memorized his cover story and polished his accent and rehearsed his movements, and who had never once thought to wonder whether the matches in his pocket might give him away. A handful of original wartime matchboxes, both British and continental imitation versions, can be found today in the collection of the Imperial War Museum in London, catalogued alongside the forged documents, the concealed wireless sets, and the other paraphernalia of a conflict fought as much in the shadows as in the skies. They sit in their cases, small and paper-covered and unremarkable, exactly as they were meant to appear. So let us return to that interrogation room in the autumn of 1940. The bombs falling somewhere to the east, the city burning, the man sitting across the table from his questioners, wondering why they are turning his matchbox over and over in their fingers. He had been trained for months. He spoke English without fault. He knew the names of the streets in the city he claimed to come from. He could describe the layout of the factory where he claimed to work, the route of the bus he claimed to take every morning, the name of his supposed landlady, and the color of the curtains in his supposed room. But he had never bought a box of matches in Britain. He had never stood at a pub counter and reached for one without thinking. He had never struck a match on a wet British morning when the box was slightly damp and the striker slightly worn, and your fingers knew before your brain what adjustment to make. He had never lived with British matches, and so when his handlers in Hamburg or Brussels or wherever it was had equipped him for his mission, they had given him what they thought was a convincing British matchbox. They had done their best. The printwork was good. The design was close. In a bad light, at a casual glance, it might have passed. It did not pass. In the long, grueling shadow war that Britain fought against German intelligence between 1939 and 1945, the weapons were not always guns or bombs or wireless sets. Sometimes the weapon was knowledge of how things felt, how they smelled, how they fitted in the hand. Knowledge accumulated through a lifetime of ordinary British existence, through 10,000 mornings and 10,000 matches struck in 10,000 ordinary moments that no spy handler on the continent could manufacture or transfer or teach. The Germans sent trained agents, equipped with forged papers and rehearsed stories and the very best imitations of British life that money and ingenuity could produce. Britain caught them with a matchbox